We're back.
We are back.
We're back, baby. Yes, yes. It's been first of all, it's been a summer. We've had a lot going on this summer, and then a much needed break where I think we just hit the wall because we were doing so much.
Yes, we did. But we've been doing a lot of work behind the scenes, looking to evolve the show. So there's been a lot going on nonetheless.
I know. So I can't wait to start all over again and start the new season of the show.
Let's get to it, Jenna.
All right. Hi, I'm Jenna,
And I'm Dom, and we're both award winning journalists.
who've recently been laid off.
Our industry is experiencing a seismic shift, and it's shed a lot of really good journalists.
So where does that leave us? Well, we're definitely laid off.
And we're looking for new jobs, looking for what's left of the industry, and what to do next.
And we're looking at all of it. So if you're a fellow laid off journalist, a working journalist, or someone who admires the craft, we're looking to build community.
Develop new skills, and try to figure out what just happened.
Welcome to Laid Off and Looking. All right. So, we're back. It's like, I guess we're calling this season 2.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
more or less. Yeah,
It's
we spent the first few episodes like figuring it out, but like now we have ideas, we have a plan, we have outlines, we have thoughts. We have a lot of thoughts.
yes, we do. It's just like it's wild to think that the summer's over. And just within a couple of
Oh, my
weeks, it's
sinuses are very well aware this summer's over.
and like the fall is right here. It's like, oh wow. But you get in that kind of back to school vibe, you know what I mean? Even though I haven't been in school in forever, but but you have that vibe going where you're like a new season, new episodes. And we've been recording and it's been honestly, I'm so excited. We loved our first season and this is really exciting too for the stuff that we've been working on with the interviews we've been having with these great guests and the discussions and it's just exciting.
No, it really is. It's so exciting. All right. So just to give people an idea of some of the stuff that we've been working on behind the scenes. So let's see, in the Wayback Machine, back to what was it like June or something like that, when we were just like, I
Yeah.
just can't anymore. I'm gonna collapse. So we took a break and then we got back together at the library where nerds
Yep.
go to plan stuff. And we had a whole brainstorming meeting about, show themes and like topics that we want to make sure that we cover and various different. So, one of the ones that we're going to start doing periodically, because again, we're a two-man team here or two person.
hmm
Yes. Um, is back to basics. And that's all about what are the basic building blocks of working in journalism in various different mediums. I mean, there's like certain things that if you walk into a print newsroom or a broadcast newsroom, that it's just sort of assumed that you know. Well, what are those things? So that's one of our themes that we're going to be looking at is the basics of journalism.
And it's great because yes, it does sort of appeal to up and coming journalists, younger people who maybe are looking at this is something that I want to do. But it also is for those who work in the industry and maybe have, challenging oneself to do maybe you're looking to expand and do something different. Maybe you're somebody who works in a different part of the industry and you're like, you know what, I want to work more on reporting. I want to work more on whatever aspect of it is. I think it's great to do a refresher. And I feel like we're giving people the opportunity to, and even for us, I know that there
I
are
was going
some
to say
things
it's
that
been refreshing for me. There's been stuff that I'm like, oh right.
things you take for granted.
You
You know what I
showed
mean?
you like once you do something and you do it over and over and over and over and over and over again for years and years and years, that there are a lot of things that you just completely you do without thinking.
Yeah.
And so to go back and sort of re-examine what are those things that I just do instinctually at this point that I don't even give thought to or probably couldn't give you a clear reason on. I just know I'm supposed to do it. That's actually really stimulating.
Yep. And I think we all have, kind of like we all have to be humble enough to realize even when you think you know it all, you actually don't. And sometimes you could, it it's nice to sort of be like, "Oh, yeah, you know what? I forgot about that." Or sometimes, for me, even though I consider when I'll tell people that I am not someone who is always very comfortable, you could be sort of I could be introverted in some ways, yet it's been a process, but there are things that people can learn about how to become somebody who still is able to put yourself out there. And sort of challenging oneself to do something different, learn something different.
Well, Dominic, I'd like to give you some snaps because I've heard from some people who I will just say are not the smoke blowing types who have all been like, Dominic's a really good interviewer. And you know what's really
I'm
messed up is that there's a part of me that's so proud and so like, yes, Dominic like has found this new lane that he can step into and own, and that's a beautiful thing. And the petty journalist in me is just like, excuse me.
Please, I learned from the best. I'm I I am the I thank you for saying that. You did not tell me this off
No, I'm telling you
mic.
right now.
So it's hitting me, but it's like, what I learned is that I have a tendency to deflect and then be like, "No, I'm not. I really oh my goodness, what are you saying?"
Own it.
But
Own
I
it.
gotta accept the flowers.
Yes.
And I have to say, like, it's been I think especially with I think I told you before how we've been doing these new interviews for the second season, and I feel a different type of confidence that I didn't have before we ended the first season. Not that I felt it was because I was still really nervous, and I still get nervous, and I'm still trying to figure some of this out for myself. Again, it's very different from being behind the scenes where all you're doing is giving the information, you do all the research, you do all the questions, when now I'm trying to find my own voice. As I think I told you for one of our interviews, I wrote an intro. I'm like, I'm still getting used to this, putting it in my own voice and not in somebody else's voice. It's very weird, but I'm getting used to it. I'm
But
only you
again,
learn
that's
this by
one of
actually
those
doing it.
subtleties that, like, again,
Yeah.
as a producer, having produced for years and years and years, that like that's become where your comfort zone is
Yes.
writing in someone else's voice. And in a weird way, I won't say that it robs you of, but you don't focus on your voice.
And sometimes some people can really switch it on. They can really do, and that's great for them. I think some of us though can it can be really intimidating because it feels like you're putting yourself out there and you start wondering how you will be judged. And what you've been teaching me for a long time is to
Oh.
not give an F sometimes and just
Eh,
be
is
you.
this how the kids do it with the
Yes,
heart?
yes, yes. Yes, exactly. But it's again learning something different and being willing to put yourself out there. All of us, if anything, I think we've been trying to tell everybody as we're still navigating what's been going on in journalism, but there's something to learn for all of us, and in the chaos that goes on in any industry is how you can switch things up, challenge yourself to do something new, to learn something new. And thank you for being so supportive. And I mean, I always like passing by these intros for you. I'm like, so how does this sound? And I appreciate the feedback because again, it's just really good of learning how to write for oneself and have your perspective too. So
Mhm. Absolutely. Well, I
exciting.
mean, you're such a wonderful co-host. It's
Oh,
so great. So great to be able to talk to you. All the time on camera and off camera, on mic and off mic. But yeah, so one of the other things that we're looking at is because we realized that a lot of the conversations we started off having were very much about print journalism, which is kind of ironic because neither one of us has worked in print.
no,
But the title of journalist, that's really broad. Like it covers a lot. Like everyone from, an executive producer to a beat reporter to a camera person, a photog, to a videographer, to an editor, to like, I mean, there's so many different job titles that fall underneath that. And I think they all deserve a chance to share what it is about what they do that is unique and maybe why it's not worth mushing the two jobs together to save money. Um,
exactly. Yeah.
my 2 cents.
Yeah.
But yeah, so those are also some of the other things that this season coming up is going to be looking at is, the different ways that people tell stories, the different mediums that we use. And also, yeah, we're going to be engaging with social media where I got to be honest, not my strength, but you
No.
know what? You got to step into it if you're going to learn it.
And again, it goes back to stepping out of your comfort zone. And also,
Oh yeah.
if you don't know what is out there, if you just think your vision of like of what a journalist is so narrow, then you miss all these other aspects of it. And I love the fact that we're able to sort of open that up for ourselves too. Again, we're on this journey with our listeners and our viewers, like, because I'm
Our
still going to say viewers
colleagues,
because of
yeah.
YouTube,
I know.
but I really do think, like, this is a way for all of us to kind of dive in deep. Like, we didn't all work in the same field, you know? Like you said, print journalism has been interesting. There's editors for that, then there's different layers of people who work within copy editors, and then you have having multiple bylines. What does that mean when you work with, other reporters on stories? So I think this is just a great way of, music journalists and film, and it's a great way to sort of just hear what's out there. So yeah,
Yeah,
excited
no.
about that too.
Excited about that. And then, of course, we are also going to switch up our spotlight. That's the last part of the show. Before we were just like, hey, this article looks interesting. Let's talk about it. And while that was fun, we thought, you know what? This segment would be a lot more useful and fruitful if we used it as a platform for independent and student journalists. So that's something else that we're going to be moving forward. That's where we're going to be looking.
Yep. And of course, we're going to ask our viewers and listeners to be really patient with us because it's adding on different elements. Like, we're really trying to challenge ourselves and make the show more engaging than it already is. And I think
I was
that
going to say,
I was
we are so engaging as we are.
and we are really trying to add different elements to it so that we hear from more voices. And some weeks that's going to work out better than others, and but we're always looking to sort of really expand the voices that we hear, the diverse voices that are out there, and giving everybody their flowers.
Absolutely. Well, with all of that in mind, we still do have headlines that we want to talk about. And this week, it's looking at the power of pop culture, how it's used by political campaigns. And the question is, how well versed do political reporters and journalists need to be on this subject? And I think actually, the Hollywood Reporter featured a story about musical hacks that the Trump campaign has that who have asked the Trump campaign to stop using their music as an example of how um being well versed in, like pop culture, etc., are just as important now, especially in this campaign season.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting to see how it's something that politicians have realized the power of pop culture. And that does, in this particular story, it does tie into this whole way of, you know what, you have this song that can really tap into an emotion to somebody, or to the message you're trying to put out there. And it can be really, really powerful. I find that it's fascinating to just see how, in this particular story,
Mhm.
they mention again, it did. It's the headline was about musical acts who've called out the 2024 Trump campaign for illegal use of their songs, and they mentioned like, yes, I remember in August there was Celine Dion's "My Heart Will Go On" was played at a rally in Montana in August, and how Celine's team they were vocal online saying like, we didn't authorize the use of that, and there have been other artists in the 2016 and 2020 races. Again, Trump. This is from the Trump campaign side where they use songs from like REM, Guns N' Roses, Neil Young, and they've all been like, stop using. But the problem has always been, or I should say, the issue has always been that nobody's ever actually filed. I guess if I'm corrected, like nobody's actually filed a lawsuit against. Um,
Well, the Isaac Hayes state was just like, "Oh, try me."
they were the ones to actually switch that up, and they went to court this week in Atlanta, if I'm correct. And that was yeah, Isaac Hayes' son, Isaac Hayes III, along with their, I guess, the estate, wanted want Trump to stop using Trump's team to stop using the song "Hold On, I'm Coming." We all know that song,
Mhm.
iconic song from Isaac Hayes, um, and so uh, basically the ruling came out. Now, this part of the report was from USA Today, and it was how a federal judge ruled that the campaign can no longer use that song. Um, it's just again, now I guess there's other aspects of are they going to be suing for licensing fees? The estate's going to be suing the campaign for licensing fees. I guess we'll see what happens with that. It's an ongoing issue, but again, why it just shows that they're willing that the desire to use these songs has there's a reason for it because
Oh, of
they know it
course.
taps into that and they know it taps into the pop culture. I noticed also on TikTok, somebody reported that Addison Rae, who has like over 88 million, followers on the app, she has a new song called Diet Pepsi.
Mhm.
And she basically was just like, it was the Harris campaign had Kamala headquarters use that on their TikTok account. They used the song for "This Is What Happened to Us in August" with video footage of Kamala Harris and just looking at the whole campaign, and they used a snippet of it, and she ended up reposting it on hers, and people are like, "Wow, that's huge!" All those followers. Now, again, do people who view that or a, an influencer sharing that, does that mean translate to votes? Probably not, but it might change the dialogue and open up people who didn't have an interest in politics. It might be like, "Oh, wow, I want to find out more about that person." So, yeah, I think
Well,
it's
it's a
really
way of
interesting.
using shorthand of connecting with people. Well, on that note, we've actually got an interview that fits right in with this, so let's get to that interview. The internet says Kamala Harris is brat, and her campaign is embracing it. Trump shares AI generated images claiming Swifties are supporting him. What do these two recent headlines have in common? Well, they show how our political leaders are increasingly using pop culture trends to connect with voters, particularly the younger ones. Now, despite their significance, pop culture and entertainment news stories are often dismissed within the journalism world as being frivolous or soft news, relegated to the very end of the news program or the back of the newspaper. However, the influence of these types of stories on public opinion and in the world of politics is anything but meaningless. So, to look further into why, we turn to Dr. Joel Penney. Now, Dr. Penney is an associate professor at the School of Communications and Media at Montclair State University. What up, Jersey? And he's also author of Pop Culture Politics, Politics and the News, Entertainment Journalism in the Polarized Media Landscape. Dr. Penney's research reveals why these seemingly soft news stories are, in fact, powerful tools in the hands of those who understand how to use them. Dr. Penney, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah. So, again, as I said in the intro, you are a professor at Montclair State University. You're not specifically a journalist, you're an academic, but you've been researching the intersection of pop culture and entertainment news within politics for years. So, first off, I just want to start with why hard news journalists and newsrooms often undervalue pop culture.
Well, yeah, that is a term when I have been conducting interviews with journalists who work in this kind of cultural and entertainment space. Undervalued is actually a word that they use quite a bit. And I think it reflects this broader culture that's often within the upper levels of the news business, newsrooms, management side of things. They tend to see the core mission of what they do, the core mission of the newsroom, as that hard news kind of category that you were talking about, where it's breaking news, politics news, often, quite serious minded. And there's a sort of an idealization of that that's been in the business for generations, taking this very serious concept of the fourth estate. And all of that is, of course, quite valuable for democracy, and it's quite necessary. But at the same time, those kinds of priorities do reflect, a way of thinking that puts culture sort of on the sidelines and marginalizes it quite a bit. And those who work in those spaces often feel like they're not taken as seriously, and more importantly, there's not as many resources invested into that product of the newsroom. Even though those products, if you want to call it that, because that's not what the language is used these days, they do tend to make a lot of money for these news companies. And these kinds of articles, like the ones you were mentioning at the start, they get a lot of clicks, they get a lot of attention. And that's what the focus is of the business, is trying to get as much attention as possible for advertisers. So, or even, just to keep subscribers going as well. But despite the fact that this stuff is, quite popular and gets a lot of attention, it's still seen as something they could do on the cheap, and they can kind of often cut corners to kind of get something out there to fill that hole in the news product. And meanwhile, those who are working in this field often feel like they want more resources to not just do the work, but to do it really well and to provide a value to the public.
Of course, of course. Can you give us any kind of examples of the different types of pop culture and entertainment news, just for anybody who might just think maybe just one slice of it, like celebrity gossip? What all are we talking about?
Yeah, it's quite actually a complex field that has a lot of different, it has a lot of diversity to it. It is interesting though, because of a lot of the cuts in newsrooms, a lot of professionals are asked to do all of this stuff kind of simultaneously, kind of wear many hats. But first, there's this sort of reporting of the entertainment business, which can often be more kind of on the kind of business side of things, like
Hmm.
looking at studios and box office. That actually gets a lot of coverage. Then you have, of course, the more kind of personal side, the celebrity coverage side, and you also have this whole tradition of criticism, which has been part of news. Particularly newspapers, but also really all kinds of news outlets for really going back to or maybe over 100 years now. If you're talking about something like movie reviews, things like that. And that actually has a bit more traditionally some prestige, that sense that the critics are these, and voices that, are kind of personalities that the audience knows and follows. And sometimes they can be quite, prestigious figures, like famous Pauline Kael, for instance, or even like Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel that people know from TV as well as newspaper. So that's a whole side of things as well. That's also been a little bit, that model has somewhat gone away in recent years, although it still exists. And then you also had to have this area of what's often called think pieces, right, which are just these, kind of short essays, sometimes could be longer essays, where, it's not the same as what's called the straight review, which is just basic, like, a new film, new movie is coming out, a new Netflix show, a new video game. And so, they'll ask to publish a review, usually with some stars, 3 or 4 stars attached to it, things like that. And then this think piece stuff, though, is, one of the innovations that's gone on in the news business in recent years to kind of stand out from the competition. Things like straight reviews are these days kind of a dime a dozen. There's so many folks who publish these stuff. So those journalists who can find a unique angle and come up with some interesting way of contextualizing what's happening. Like take the story of Charlie XCX endorsing Kamala Harris, and write this interesting little historical breakdown of why that matters and how it relates to things in the past. That's another major sort of area of this cultural coverage. And if you click at something like the what's called the vertical, right, those little tabs at the top of a news website's page, and if you click on something called culture or even entertainment, you're going to see all this stuff kind of thrown in and mixed together. It's quite a mess in a way. Of different kinds of traditions and different kinds of news that cover different angles. But all this stuff is included in what we would refer to as cultural journalism.
Professor, there's an interesting of how do political parties utilize pop culture figures and symbols to connect with the public? Like, for example, the DNC using, symbols of American iconography, and the RNC using figures like Hulk Hogan to connect with their audiences.
Well, yeah, that's been a trend that's gone on for many decades now. I mean, the idea that politicians will align with, pop culture as a way to relate to, the voting public. I've seen evidence of that going back. I mean, when you're talking about sort of what we think of as modern pop culture, there was a documentary that came out a few years ago about Jimmy Carter and how he sort of made these friendships with the countercultural rock scene in the 1970s, like, having Allman Brothers concerts for the Carter campaign. So that stuff has actually been very well established, and the Republicans try to do that as well, although they're sort of infamous for maybe not being as well connected with the celebrity world. They're certainly trying that. If you watch the RNC, right, they really spotlighted folks like Hulk Hogan, and they had all these other like Amber Rose was this person who was on, this kind of gossip kind of celebrity figure. So they definitely understand that kind of strategy. It kind of goes back to what I was talking about before. It's about attention. We're living in this now attention economy, as it's called, and the kind of stuff that politics is usually known for, which are speeches, discussions of policy, which can often be interpreted by the public as dry and boring. And they know that stuff doesn't always sink in as well. So you bring out a celebrity and it tends to be memorable. It gets eyeballs, it gets attention. And so in the internet age, I think that those techniques have been ratcheted up even further. They also, of course, rely on the news to cover that stuff. Not everybody's going to be watching, let's say, a political speech on TV or even the conventions. So, if they bring out Hulk Hogan, it's going to get a ton of media hits. And that is part of the strategy that campaigns understand they need to get coverage. And so they're going to do things that can garner that coverage. And going back to what I was saying before, put a celebrity in a headline, people are going to click on it more than if it just, doesn't have that in the headlines. So it's a savvy strategy. It can backfire sometimes as well. People think that it's being done, just in a way that's not authentic, right? But it's actually now at this point, kind of an American political tradition.
I just want to throw in that, like, until you mentioned it, I had completely forgotten about Amber Rose's appearance at the RNC, but that speaks to, again, the attention economy and how short our attention spans have gotten, because that was the talk of the RNC. Yeah, and it completely left my brain until just now.
Yeah, and it may not necessarily be designed to last, but at the moment, it got those clicks, it got that attention, and that's kind of what it was designed for.
Absolutely.
You've written also about how the right wing's approach to pop culture has sort of evolved over time. Um, how has it evolved, and also what impact does it sort of have on how the news is like presented and consumed?
Well, in my book, I was had been researching both kind of left wing and right wing sort of angles of this kind of politics pop culture coverage. And in talking with folks who work for like conservative news publications, I interviewed quite a few of them. What they relayed to me was that there's been this kind of hands-off relationship to pop culture, often because it was seen as so liberal. So if it wasn't called woke before that, it was called politically correct, PC. And there was that kind of alienation that really started to happen, or maybe around the time of the 1990s, when there were a lot more efforts on what we think of as now as progressive politics to really mobilize in pop culture and talk about representation. And that's a lot of the stuff that these days gets a lot of backlash and reactionary discourse. But there was this period where, as was explained to me, conservative news outlets were trying to sometimes cover pop culture, and the audience wasn't interested in it. They just kind of figured that's for the liberals, that's not for us. Barring this kind of very specific kind of niche segment, which is often like Christian entertainment, that sort of thing, stuff that's very much targeted to that kind of red state America kind of profile. But the sort of change that I was documenting in the book was that in recent years, really we're talking about the last few decades, maybe the last 20 years or so, there's been this kind of growing interest on the conservative side of kind of engaging with pop culture more on a day-to-day basis. And often that this is very much in that kind of backlash reactionary mode, like, oh, what did this crazy celebrity say about Donald Trump? Or what did Disney do next in terms of putting a gay character in a children's movie? How dare they? That kind of thing. That stuff has been seen as working more with their audience. There's a sort of a suggestion that it tends to work more with a younger audience that's quote unquote more pop culture savvy or more engaged, or more maybe into these like fandoms like Star Wars. Or if you follow like the stories of Star Wars fandom, they've really been kind of dealing with this onslaught of right-wing reactionaries, really objecting to casting more women and people of color in these major roles that are sort of used to being white men in those roles. And that's the kind of stuff that conservative publications realize. Our audience is really primed for this. They're interested in it. They're going to put out more articles, think pieces, opinion pieces about that sort of thing, because the audience seems to be ready for it, or they're at least sort of but thinking more about pop culture as this battlefield that they want to engage in, as opposed to just sort of swear off. And I will say, I don't want to maybe go on too long, but in my
Oh, you're
research, a lot
fine.
of the sort of impetus for this shift was really tied to this one person who really pioneered this kind of way of thinking in the right-wing world. And his name is Andrew Breitbart, and we know Breitbart from the news site that he founded. Andrew Breitbart actually died, I think, over 10 years ago, so he's kind of long gone from this world, but he left a lasting legacy. Even when I brought this stuff up with um, right-wing journalists, they were constantly talking about Andrew Breitbart's influence. That he was the one. He wrote several books on this topic. He had this kind of famous saying that politics is downstream from culture. That was sort of the mantra that he is sort of known for, meaning that if the Republicans want to win these political battles, they have to focus on culture as a means to do so. And so he was one of this, actually, before he even founded Breitbart News, he had a site called Big Hollywood, which kind of tells you about sort of what his priorities were. He actually also was a failed Hollywood sort of creative himself. He kind of came from that world. But that was very interesting to see all these different journalists who were more kind of on the conservative side saying, yes, it was this Breitbart kind of concept, like, yes, we need to engage in the cultural world more. And that's been something that's now, as one person told me, like constantly repeated in these conservative circles, like we need to engage with the culture.
It's just interesting, Joel, because I feel like, back in the early 2000s, that's where you started hearing a lot about the war on Christmas, that cultural war on Christmas. And it kind of built in some ways from that, people feeling like now all of a sudden culture was used as a way to, as a tool to say, hey, we're under attack. Our values are under attack, and using a way of looking at pop culture, because that's something everybody can sort of, in some form or fashion, they can associate with.
Yeah, it's all these topics are seen as accessible for the public a lot more often than like traditional news. That's a word that comes up quite a bit too. Is that sense of anyone can kind of understand it pretty quickly. It resonates. It's emotional. Not to say
Mhm.
that other kinds of like hard news necessarily don't trigger emotions. But the news business is very much aware of how they need to engage people emotionally to get them to click, to get them to share, all that stuff. And these kinds of stories, they're, something like Christmas. I mean, it goes to people's sense of identity, their sense of, just kind of where they fit in the culture. And, one of the things I kind of cover in the book is this idea that there's this sort of outrage machine, and they're sort of building. Often, a lot of this news coverage is designed to trigger outrage and kind of foster it, because it's good for attention, it's good for clicks, good for business, and this is the kind of stuff that absolutely gets people outraged in a way that maybe they don't respond to policy positions in the same kind of fashion. But yeah, over time, certainly these things come in waves. And they kind of go in and out of the headlines. But we've seen kind of the slow and steady increase of those kind of culture war type stories, certainly over the last few decades.
And I was actually, when you mentioned that, that came to mind because uh, I've noticed, at least as a journalist, people sometimes can get confused about how the government works. I'll put it nicely. Sometimes people can get confused. I won't say some people just don't understand. But there does seem to be like a confusion with, what exactly different branches are responsible for, who does what. Um, Policy can be so wonky and so esoteric to people that it's hard to wrap their head around. But yeah, you get that instant emotional connection or reaction when a politician shows up with a certain celebrity. So that makes sense. I'm wondering if there's any example of where this has put someone over the top, where a politician did something in the cultural space or was with a pop culture uh, icon, for lack of a better description, and it gave them the edge to actually win an election.
It's an interesting question because there's really no way of knowing what exactly puts a candidate into the victory column. There's so many factors, what we call intervening factors. In social science, we can't really run experiments like this to see, oh, what would happen if, Trump did this or Biden did that. We can't, replicate that kind of stuff. So
Well,
from
frankly,
a
I was
social
thinking
science
this.
perspective, it's all guesswork.
Yeah.
But that being said, the narratives matter. When people tend to kind of come to a consensus like, oh, that's what really helped or hurt this particular political campaign. That can have an influence to it. Some of the most sort of noteworthy campaigns in terms of pop culture don't end up always winning. That's not to say though that they don't have some kind of influence over the direction of American politics. But I would say, certainly if you look back, the first Obama election, 2008, was one where, the fact that he was labeled a celebrity and the campaign was very, focused on putting, the Jay-Z's of the world on stage with Obama during, things like campaign events. And, that was certainly something that got people to pay attention. And, even further back, I mentioned Jimmy Carter, but, there's often in the past tends to be like these Democratic campaigns when they're winning that people look at the pop culture stuff and say, oh, that really mattered. Like when Bill Clinton won in 1992,
That was literally
people,
the
there
example that
was
came to
all this talk
mind.
about, wow, that Fleetwood Mac song that he used as campaign, is it, I can't even remember which one
Don't
it
stop
was.
thinking about
Don't stop
tomorrow.
thinking
Oh, there
about
we go.
tomorrow,
Yeah.
right? It's a good campaign
Yep.
slogan. And his, playing the saxophone on Arsenio Hall, that's a clip that's been replayed
Exactly.
a million times at this point. But really, every single campaign has been trying to do this stuff. And as I said before, a lot of this is with the press coverage in mind. And, it's really interesting to watch, for instance, these two different, conventions that just happened. They're both bringing on celebrities. So we mentioned, bringing out Amber Rose, who's this figure in the hip hop world, on the RNC side. And then on the DNC side, they brought out the rapper Lil Jon to do one of the sort of roll call events during the actual on the convention floor. And so it's no longer, I think, just maybe one party that's doing this. There is a sense that this is geared towards a younger demographic, and Democrats traditionally have done better with younger voters than Republicans. But that might be why you're seeing on the Republican side so much emphasis. I mean, people really didn't take a note of the amount of kind of pop culture content was being pushed in the RNC. And, the Hulk Hogan thing was, in some ways, maybe it was seen by maybe got some bad coverage, like, oh, this is going too far, it's getting too stupid. I saw
Yeah,
a
I was
lot of
gonna say it was definitely a
side by side
spectacle.
comparisons with Idiocracy, that movie where like this kind of wrestler type is the president. So there's always a risk of how it's perceived, but it's definitely a strategy that is continuing to be pushed because of a lot of things. It's attention, but it's also emotion and identification. And what pop culture really represents to the public is ways of figuring out your identity in this sort of weird postmodern world that we're in. A lot of how we identify is by what we consume and sort of what we attach. That sort of explains why fandoms have become such this huge phenomenon in the last few decades, because it's a way for people finding identity in a world where people are seeking that kind of identification. So the political world, they want you to identify to the degree that you're willing to cast that vote or call yourself a Republican or a Democrat. So they're quite at this point, because of these past success stories that, like we talked about, are very much have that in mind. Like, how do we get to the public to not just, agree with a candidate's position, but to identify with them?
It's just wanted to mention something here that I thought was so interesting was, when you talked about trying to, I guess, attract younger voters, and you look at Donald Trump, for instance, like I know they had Hulk Hogan at the event, um, but it's also interesting to see that, he went for Taylor Swift too. I mean, when there was that AI created image, he understands the importance, or the campaign understands the importance of Swifties, whether or not obviously it was AI generated, it wasn't real, but at the same point, there is value for him in trying to show, I get it. I see how important Taylor is to you. I accept, I accept your support. So it's so interesting to me to see people try so hard to really connect. Um, but it's also interesting to see, is it a real connection, or are people just trying hard? Like, you know what I mean? Like when you're too thirsty for that connection, that it doesn't come across as being genuine. Therefore, like, okay, I mean, we all could throw out names of younger celebrities. That doesn't really mean you understand me or understand why they're important to me.
Yeah, I mean, it revolves around this concept of authenticity, which is pretty, hard to pin down. And yeah, it can be done in ways that are authentic or inauthentic. I recall that the 2016 Hillary Clinton campaign, it got a lot of spitballs thrown at them from different sides. And one of the things, was kind of highlighting, is she really authentic when she's, putting like Katy Perry on stage, or is it all just sort of this sham or this pandering idea, like pandering to young voters? So they have to be kind of careful about that. But, the press plays a big role in how this stuff gets interpreted. And whether or not these things are deemed authentic or not. It kind of goes back again to, why look at these like pop culture journalists. They're often providing this instant analysis anytime one of these things happens, and you do want people who know what they're talking about to. And it's why we want to invest in quality journalism on that front. But yeah, they certainly will kind of play a role in the kind of the framing of these different stabs at cultural relevance and cultural authenticity.
All right, that leads into a perfect question about authenticity, because when Kamala was announced that she would be the replacement on the top of the Democratic ticket, and Charlie XCS came out and was just like, Kamala's brat. Watching some more hard news journalists have to address this subject was one of the most awkward things I have ever heard or seen in broadcasting. But it gave such an intense sense of not only authenticity, but also maybe even disinterest. Like, I can't believe I have to read this copy about this nonsense. It seemed like there was a huge disconnect between this moment that really sort of jump started this campaign and put fire behind it, and the people who traditionally cover, again, political news, feeling like, I'm sorry, what?
Yeah, there's absolutely, that hard news, soft news distinction we were talking about is, definitely kind of part of the kind of philosophy that I think a lot of, journalistic professionals, particularly who work on that, kind of hard news side, they definitely see a hierarchy in a way of importance and priorities. And, something I was talking about a lot in the book that I published was, this really the need for news organizations to invest in quality news. That really does take money to pay for people's salaries, not just, like kind of intermittent freelance opportunities, but to have full-time staff positions for people who have the wherewithal, the expertise to actually weigh in on something like the Kamala Brat story. And it is important. It is actually consequential for the direction of the election campaign, for instance, as you're saying. So it really does illustrate the need to have people who can provide the public with some quality analysis of what that means, put it into context. And unfortunately, we haven't gotten into so much of this in our conversation, but there have been a lot of cuts to the kind of the culture desk, and that sense that that it makes money for the news companies, but they can kind of do it on the cheap. They can cut back on the full-time staff that had been there maybe in the past, and just sort of slap together some stuff through freelancing. This is a big issue that, of course, in the news business generally, but I think it's particularly pronounced on the culture side. There's this sense that, there's so many, one interviewee, journalist told me this in an interview, like, there's no shortage of, graduate students out there that really want to write about, Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon and how it relates to, gender or race or something. So this idea that, there's this cheap labor force out there that is ready to talk about this stuff, and so they can again cut corners on the in terms of just the actual expenditures, and not necessarily continue to employ full-time staff whose job is to be the pop culture expert. But because of what's going on in our world, in our country, I would definitely make the case that it is important to have those kinds of positions as part of the newsroom, because culture, what Andrew Breitbart was saying, as we go back before, it was not exactly, totally off there. I mean, the culture has a huge impact on our political world. And so if we're going to have political coverage, it needs to include that. And we need to have people who are doing this that actually are prepared for that task at hand.
Yeah, because there's something that annoys me that just drives me up the wall is when I hear people kind of say, well, the intern told me or the PA told me. And it's sort of like, but you yourself should be plugged into this. Like, journalists need to understand too that they're obviously these have cultural impacts, and we know that. And it's like it has an effect. The audience is, and I just think like that part of it needs to be sort of hit home, that it's not beneath you to know something like we can't know everything. We understand that, but it also isn't beneath you. And I think that's what sometimes can get on my nerves is the fact that you get that sense that there are journalists who think like, why am I even talking about this? This is like beneath me, and I should be talking about things that are more important. But this is important, and it's important to a part of your audience that you could be connecting to. Um, a- but just to go into something else, because I think it's important, is the fact of the role that digital media has sort of changed this conversation. Platforms like TikTok, they're kind of reshaping how they're sort of reshaping how pop culture journalism is sort of consumed and how it's relayed to the audience, especially in terms of younger audiences.
Yeah, it's certainly created a lot more competition. Now when you're, saying like, oh, there's some discourse, as we call it, breaking out about, something in pop culture that might relate to an issue. You're not just going to get, the major news or outlets covering it, but this huge kind of sea of social media content, opinion, TikTok videos, and it's created a far more crowded and more competitive environment. And that really has played a role in that sort of the devaluing stuff that I was talking about before, where now if you have a point of view on let's say the Charlie XCX story, you're just one of so many voices out there that are available for people instantly on their phones. That kind of move towards amateur, that's been reshaping our media environment. Talking
Big
before about
time.
the conventions coverage, that's been a big story, right? About inviting in these digital creators who have a whole different set of standards, right? They're not journalists. They're not there to report accurately or objectively. They're more in the capacity of PR. And there is, of course, a lot of serious issues that come up with that there about who are these digital creators and what agenda may or may not have, and what their relationship is to a sense of journalistic ethics or even standards and norms. But it's definitely part of the environment, and it's made, I think, the work of journalists a little bit more difficult because they have to keep up. Not only just keep up with that, they have to compete with these voices on TikTok or voices on different social media platforms. And part of standing out from that noise or just that sea of information and opinion is sometimes coming up with these very strong angles, or sometimes it's referred to negatively as hot take, right? But it's to have a take that no one else has on the internet, that might drive attention your way. And so a lot of the trick now in this field of journalism in general, and maybe a lot of these in this kind of pop culture space where people have all these different takes and feel like they can weigh in on the story of the day, is to find that unique distinctive angle that will stand you out from everyone else, because it is really, really crowded out there in terms of just the sea of what's available.
So much of what we've talked about, of course, is what's relevant right now. But I'm wondering if you could also give us an example of historical example specifically where the intersection of entertainment news and political news impacted the politics of our country. Because what comes to mind, to me at least, is the Hollywood blacklist or the LGBTQ plus movement, et cetera. But are there instances where that's happened?
Yeah, you can find that really throughout American history, and I'm sure in other countries as well. So that research is mostly focused on the U.S. In the book, I talk about the immense amount of news coverage that the film Birth of a Nation received, and very the early part of the 20th century. That became that kind of political lightning rod for questions about race in America. And it was one of the for instance, African American newspapers were publishing what we would today call think pieces, taking a stand against Birth of the Nation and why it presented a danger to the public in terms of, stereotyping and that whole concept of representation matters, right? That's not a new story. That's been going on for over 100 years easily. You go maybe more into the more recent past, one of the things I've seen, there's been a lot of now, scholars such as myself trying to make the case that cultural journalism matters. If you look at some of the recent movements, social movements, like for instance, hashtag Me Too, yes, it was a social media phenomenon, but really took the investigative journalism. I think it was some reporters of the New York Times, right? They had a movie made about them who were investigating Harvey Weinstein to kind of kick off that whole Me Too movement, and kind of exposing these Hollywood, the wrongdoing of these Hollywood executives and other kinds of, major public figures and celebrities. And, you can say that these, quote unquote entertainment journalists covering Harvey Weinstein changed the world in terms of really, kind of popularizing the issue of, workplace sexual harassment and assault, and kind of launched, not necessarily founded the Me Too movement, but certainly, pushed it into another level in terms of public attention. Another one that came up that I talk about in the book is the Oscars So White campaign, the hashtag campaign. And again, that's a social media activism campaign. It was this, it's pretty well known that there was this activist named April Rain who kind of came up with the first tweet, the first hashtag. But as I discuss in the book, that stuff, it can go viral to a degree, but when we often talk about social media virality, we're not always fully factoring in, how the journalism industry magnifies those trends and kind of plucks them out and blows them up into another level and kind of feeds back into the system. So a lot of times now, if people are sharing a story about Oscars So White, they may not be sharing the original activist hashtag, but they're sharing, oh, here's, this pop culture news sites article that talks about it, right? So journalists play a big role in, commenting on these issues that often have a big, social consequence. But also, these days, even though this stuff is often coming out of this kind of social media amateur world, these news professionals are playing a big role in augmenting and magnifying and kind of putting a much more concentrated spotlight. So something like, would Me Too have happened if it was just a hashtag online and not this very constant focus of news attention, getting a lot of articles written about it and such. So I would point to those as examples where we really do see the impact.
Well, this is great. Thank you so much, Dr. Perry, for joining us, Dr. Penny. And we'd love to. This has been a great conversation. We always ask like a last question about how did somebody became interested in journalism, but obviously, for you, our question is, how did you become interested in studying this field work of pop culture, entertainment, news, and the impact that it has in terms of politics? How did you become interested in that?
Well, for me, I'm very interested in those questions of impact. I was kind of talking about before, and really noticed that in the current kind of landscape of what we call journalism studies, it kind of reflects some of these biases and sort of philosophies we've been talking about through this whole conversation. That just like journalism, the industry, the folks who study this stuff, and there's a lot of back and forth between, tend to have this kind of hierarchy in mind that traditional politics coverage is really what's important, and that culture stuff is the soft news that we may or may not really be necessary. And it's really reflected in the fact that there have been a few research studies that have been done on this kind of topic. Actually, there have been quite a few in Europe, which I found quite interesting.
Wow.
In Europe, and I think that becomes from a different orientation to the idea of culture. I think in European countries, you see a lot more government spending on cultural affairs, and there's that sense of our culture is thousands of years old. We need to have this kind of public investment in it. And that is actually reflected in cultural journalism, and even in the fact that people who are studying this stuff are giving that serious attention and taking it seriously. When you go to the US, it's far less so. And, I'm always kind of interested in finding the stories and finding the topics that are underexplored and that kind of need more attention. And I can do that in this kind of work. Putting a spotlight on these journalists who are, they're dealing with a lot of economic issues with the industry. As I said, culture desks are facing a lot of problems at the, even maybe to a degree, even further than other parts of the business, but they still play this very important role. And it's one that is, again, understudied and underexplored. So we need to put, more focus on it and understand where this news comes from, who's making it, and ultimately how it's going to impact things like the upcoming presidential election, because it absolutely does.
All right. Well, Dr. Penny, I want to thank you so much for taking time to join us and to have this, I think, incredibly important conversation that we've exhaustively discussed how and why it gets dismissed. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Laid Off and Looking.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Laid Off and Looking is an independent podcast conceived of and created by Jenna Flanagan and Dominic Camia. Music provided by Jay Cowett, research by Lori Ruthenberger. Reach out to us anytime at laidofandlookingpod@gmail.com. New episodes drop every Friday at noon.